Show me what solidarity looks like. Show me what solidarity looks like.
This is what solidarity looks like.
My name is Steiner. I'm an activist, organizer, and host of the Facebook Live show, The Robust Opposition. When the Supreme Court decided in the dead of night Wednesday to let stand the Texas abortion ban, the most restrictive in the nation, I realized I could not sit idly by and watch this happen. I contacted the SochFem collective of the Asheville DSA, right there, and asked them if they wanted to help me plan a speak out. We call this a speak out because we want to invite women to speak out on their own experiences with abortion and why having that right was so important to them. I actually had 2 abortions. I managed to go my whole teens and 20s, but 2 abortions in my late 20s, even though the man who was involved was the man I later married. But at the time of the first one, we had just started dating, and at the time of the second one, it was about a year later, we still weren't planning to get married. And I don't want anyone to think that I was cavalier about birth control. In the first instance, the morning after pill failed, and in the second instance, there was a hole in the condom. And I want to say we sued the condom company and won. It's good to have a fiance who is an attorney. So I was happy to have the option in California to have a safe and legal abortion. My mother was not so fortunate 25 years ago. In 1963, we went on what I thought was merely a vacation to Puerto Rico during the Christmas holiday. Home movies of that trip show my sister and I frolicking in the pool and trying to catch lizards. I didn't find out until decades later that the impetus to go there was so that my mother could have an abortion. See, she already had 2 children, and she didn't want to have any more. Her right to have bodily autonomy and to family plan. But she was privileged. Because in those days, before Roe versus Wade and before California became the first state to legalize abortion in 1967, that is what privileged women could do. They could afford to fly to another country or after 1967 another state to have an abortion. Poor women were forced to obtain illegal, potentially unsafe, back alley, coat hanger abortions. As a teenager, I used to read Ms. Magazine, which just got launched, and proudly called myself a feminist. I made a speech in high school on behalf of the Equal Rights Amendment and participated in Take Back the Night marches in college against rape. Yet over the last 40 years, I have seen many women's rights that we have fought so hard to attain, most notably women's reproductive rights, be whittled away. I was amazed to find out only this morning that before Reagan, more Republicans actually supported abortion rights than Democrats. Did anyone know that? And I feel like as a history major, I should have known that. The following is from an article by Sue Halpern in the New York Review called How Republicans Became Anti-Choice. And much of this article was taken from a documentary called Reversing Roe. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, many Republicans were behind efforts to liberalize and even decriminalize abortion. Theirs was the party of reproductive choice, while Democrats with their large Catholic constituency were the opposition. Republican Governor Ronald Reagan signed the California Therapeutic Abortion Act, one of the most liberal abortion laws in the country, in 1967, legalizing abortion for women whose mental or physical health would be impaired by pregnancy or whose pregnancies were the result of rape or incest. The same year, Republican strongholds of North Carolina and Colorado made it easier for women to obtain abortions. New York, under Governor Nelson Rockefeller, a Republican, eliminated all restrictions on women seeking to terminate pregnancies up to 24 weeks gestation. The documentary Reversing Roe shows young women in Dallas boarding airplanes headed to these states, and they informally called these flights, because there were so many, the abortion special. Richard Nixon, Barry Goldwater, Gerald Ford, and George Herbert Walker Bush were all pro-choice, and they were not party outliers. In 1972, and this is what blows me away, a Gallup poll found that 68% of Republicans believed abortion to be a private matter between a woman and her doctor. The government, they said, should not be involved. But since Reagan, Republicans began to see that abortion could be a good issue to get certain constituencies into the party. And that was tied into racism. Paul Weyrich, a Republican strategist who worked for Reagan, found they could use abortion to attract voters because it was more popular than outright racism. A Frontline documentary called Supreme Revenge chronicles Mitch McConnell's 30-year efforts to remake the U.S. court system, not just the Supreme Court, more favorable to the fundamentalist views of the Federalist Society, one of the ultimate goals being to overturn Roe versus Wade. And during this time, Republican-dominated state legislatures began writing laws that made it increasingly to get abortions practically, even while they remained legal technically. You had to get parental consent, undergo counseling, view the fetal heartbeat, etc. At the same time, Operation Rescue was bombing abortion clinics, killing abortion providers, and organizing protests outside abortion clinics to harass and intimidate women going for their procedures. In 1992, the Casey decision, the first step towards repealing Roe versus Wade, was issued by the Supreme Court. It replaced the trimester standards of Roe with the fetal viability standard. The current Texas bill is part of a category called fetal heartbeat bills, which prohibit abortion after 6 weeks, before most women even know they're pregnant. It's practically a total ban, as 85 to 90% of abortions are performed after 6 weeks. Knowing that the bill could be overturned in a lawsuit, Texas legislators put a clause in there saying that the government would not be enforcing the ban. Citizens would, and they could get $10,000. Justice Sotomayor said in her dissent that this law, quote, deputized the state's citizens as bounty hunters, offering them cash prizes for civilly prosecuting their neighbors' medical procedures. Boo! Boo! Right. Now, the issue of reproductive freedom comes to the national attention every time there is a new Supreme Court nominee or case like this, but it would be unfair to say the Democrats have been blameless. Many Democrats on the Judiciary Committee voted for these anti-choice justices when they were being appointed to the lower courts. Joe Biden, when he was head of the Judiciary Committee overseeing the Clarence Thomas confirmation hearings in 1991, refused to call women who wanted to corroborate Anita Hill's story. In 2008, Hillary Clinton ran with Tim Kaine as her vice president, an opponent of abortion for much of his political career. And in 2017, Nancy Pelosi said abortion rights should not be a litmus test for Democratic candidates. And Joe Biden only reversed his support of the Hyde Amendment in 2019. Hyde prohibits most federal programs, including Medicaid, from funding abortions, again discriminating against poor women. Yet, at this point in time, Democrats are our only hope, and therefore, our next speaker, Democratic State Senator Julie Mayfield from North Carolina's 49th District, will speak about what North Carolina Democrats are prepared to do if Republicans should introduce a copycat bill in our legislature. And I will come back at the end and talk briefly about what you all can do.
Thank you, Lauren. Lauren just did something that we don't very often see and do, and that is talk openly and honestly about our experience as women with abortion. And that is something I think it is hard, but it is something that we need to do to put this conversation in a different plane. So thank you, Lauren, very much. So as Lauren said, I am Julie Mayfield. I represent most of you probably in the North Carolina Senate, and I appreciate that privilege and I thank you for it. She has asked me to talk about what would happen if such a bill were introduced into the North Carolina legislature, and I am going to talk about that, but I want to talk about something else real quick first. So we have heard a lot over the last 18 months about personal choice, individual freedoms, bodily integrity, no government mandates. Wouldn't it be nice if all of that national conversation and all of that enormous push around those topics were about reproductive freedom? As you know, it has not been about that. There was even a bill introduced in the North Carolina legislature called My Body, My Choice. But it was not introduced by a progressive Democrat. And it was not about reproductive freedom. It was introduced by a conservative Republican, and it was an anti-vaccine, anti-masking bill. I will note the irony that that legislator and his wife both got sick with COVID, both went to the hospital for several days, perhaps taking up beds that could have been used by people who did not get sick because of their own personal decisions. That is another conversation. So if you believe in individual freedoms, I hate that word, it's freedom, individual freedom, if you believe in personal choice, if you believe in bodily integrity, and you believe that the government shouldn't put mandates in place about what you do with your body, then you should believe, if you believe that about masks and vaccines, you should believe it about reproductive freedom too. All of those people who believe that should be standing here with us. And the fact that they are not is inconsistent, it's intellectually incompatible, and it's hypocritical. So now I'm going to talk about North Carolina. I just had to get that off my chest. So could we have a Texas law here in North Carolina? Theoretically, yes, but there are 4 things that would have to happen, and I'm going to talk about each one. So first is somebody would have to introduce a bill. That can happen. Anybody can introduce a bill. So if a bill gets introduced, don't freak out quite yet. Second thing, the legislature, both houses of the legislature would have to pass that bill. Could that happen? Absolutely. As you know, the legislature, both houses are controlled by Republicans. They have a majority. They don't need Democrats to pass bills. So that could happen too. In fact, there's already been one anti-abortion bill that's passed this session, both houses. But the third step is where we start to win. And that is that we have Democratic Governor Roy Cooper. And thank God, Governor Cooper vetoed the one bill that already made it through the legislature, and he would veto any other bill, including a Texas-style abortion bill. So we have that backstop. Then the question becomes, what about a veto override? And most of you will know that for most of the last decade, Democrats, we didn't have enough people in the legislature to sustain the governor's veto. That changed in 2018. And Susan Fisher, who I think is speaking later, can speak to the House, but in the Senate, you need 30 people to override a veto. The Republicans have 28 members. So they need 2 others. And they ain't getting them from this stand of Democrats. It's not happening. We are 22 strong, and we are proud of it. We will support our governor on these issues and a whole range of others. So all of that to say, I do not think that it is a threat to us now. But many of you also know that we are starting the redistricting process. And we are going to be redrawing state, House, and Senate districts and congressional districts. It is absolutely possible for the Republicans to draw maps that are likely to, or more likely to, give them their veto-proof majorities again. And so we have to guard against that. Now, what I can tell you is that Democrats in the legislature are working hard on that issue. We are working with national level expert groups that work on redistricting, and we are as prepared as we can be to try to keep that from happening. But as you know, they can pass what they want to pass, and the governor doesn't get to veto maps. Maps do not go to the governor. So if they pass maps that are going to give them veto-proof majorities again, we will need to be ready, and I know that there will be, groups ready to file the lawsuits that we will need to overturn those maps. So here's what I would say is we're safe now, but we need to pay attention during redistricting. We need to be ready to fight the maps, and whatever maps are in place for next year's election, we need to be ready to support the Democratic candidates in any district that they're running in. Now, Susan and I are incredibly lucky. We get to represent you. We get to represent the city of Asheville. And so we are not at risk. But there are many seats out there that are democratically held now that could be at risk. And so we will need to work for those candidates, we will need to work for those people, and we will need to make sure that we keep at least the number of seats that we have now in the House and Senate, if not gain some. So thank you very much for being here. Thank you for being in this fight, and we're gonna have to keep it up.
We're also going to have to start talking to our Republican friends to start putting pressure on their Republican representatives. The last Gallup poll in 2018, I think it said 48% of people are pro-life, 48% are pro-choice, but 64% of people believe that a woman should have the right to choose and that the government should not interfere. So don't assume that just because you have a Republican friend, it means they are pro-life. We need to enlist them in this fight, especially if, the maps get redrawn and Cooper cannot veto it. The other thing is that it's also happening in these Republican legislatures are these voting rights acts that are basically getting rid of voting rights for the very people who would vote for Democrats. So we have to be supportive. We have to pay attention to what's going on in national politics right now. And we have to pressure people like Manchin and Sinema, who are Democrats, who refuse to overturn the filibuster. I mean, Joe Biden's infrastructure plan, which Bernie Sanders pretty much crafted, $3.5 trillion of social spending for so many of the causes that we all believe in, is at risk if we don't overturn the filibuster. The Voting Rights Act is at risk. So many things are at risk. And here to talk about what's going on in Congress, in the U.S. Congress, is Susan Fisher, who is a lifelong Buncombe County resident and has represented the 114th District in the legislature, in the House, for the last 18 years. Susan.
I am so glad to see this great group out here on a day like today. And it is Labor Day, after all, right? You can be sure that there are people laboring somewhere, because there are people out in Asheville shopping and dining and doing the things they do on a holiday. But I want to tell you that to me, Labor Day means solidarity. Labor Day is a day to remind us of the hard-working people in our country. We cannot forget who have been at the front lines during the pandemic. Labor Day is a day to keep that in mind and to think about the fact that we need to raise the minimum wage. I know that that's not the topic of today's gathering, but it has so much to do with the harm that is being perpetrated by the Congress, the Republican Congress, I'll say. As Lauren, I want to thank you for inviting me to come today, and Julie, thank you for your words and bringing reality here to this group about what it's like in the North Carolina legislature. But I want to talk a little bit about what I heard on national TV in the aftermath of the decision of the Supreme Court to just sit by and watch this bill become law. The Supreme Court, as Lauren described, decided late Wednesday in a 5-4 ruling. They refused to block a law that prohibits abortion 6 weeks after contraception and only makes exceptions for medical emergencies. The law authorizes, here we have now bounty hunters who can now go car to car or door to door and collect a reward for turning in anyone who aids someone in getting an abortion, seeking the health care that they deserve. Most women don't even realize they're pregnant at 6 weeks. So what must happen? Lauren said, Congress must codify access to an abortion for women to fully protect the precedent set by Roe v. Wade. Speaker Nancy Pelosi said that when the House returns later this month, it will vote on the Women's Health Protection Act to codify Roe v. Wade. That's the House. They will return from recess to vote on that in the House, but the bill is unlikely to pass the Senate, where it would need to overcome the 60-vote filibuster. So what must we do? We must kill the filibuster. You know, we change ancient laws all the time. North Carolina is particularly well known for ancient laws that need to be taken off the books. This is one that needs to be taken off the books. This should not be a rule in the Senate. We need to kind of take the wind out of the sails of Senator Sinema and Manchin. The Hyde Amendment. You heard that mentioned earlier. The Hyde Amendment, which first passed Congress in 1976 to prohibit federal funds, specifically Medicaid, to be used to pay for abortions. Well, Biden changed his stance during the 2020 election season. Thank goodness. And I think that gave everybody some hope. He said that he can no longer support it, and he said Republicans' efforts to restrict abortion prompted him to change his mind. In fact, the president did not include the Hyde Amendment in his budget request. It has been in the budgets before now, but Biden did not include the Hyde Amendment in his budget. Planned Parenthood said at the time that it was exciting to see the administration's important step. So, also notable is Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley from Massachusetts. She introduced an amendment to strip the Hyde Amendment from the House budget bill and is an active supporter of women's rights in the U.S. House. It's harder than you think, and I can bear witness to it from the state level, to get an amendment to pass, much less to get the leadership to say that your amendment meets their rules, because the rules are a moving target. This is the same problem as with voting rights. I say that it is even the same problem with women's equal rights. These are all issues that affect folks who are least able to do anything about it. The young, the poor, people of color, people struggling to make ends meet, people of color and those living in rural areas who already face the largest barriers to health care will be most harmed by this law. Traveling out of state for care will require additional expenses, hotel stays, transportation, child care, and it will result in lost wages. This is a burden that will fall hardest on Black women given the stark disparities in maternal health, and particularly in Texas, this is true. The numbers bear it out. So, what do we do? Let me go back to North Carolina again. These are the kinds of things we have to stand in solidarity against. North Carolina's Republican lieutenant governor said just recently that when a woman becomes pregnant, she is no longer in charge of her body. No longer in charge of her body? No longer? So now what? The government is in charge of her body? The very thing, as Julie described, Senator Mayfield, the very thing that right-wing Republicans rail against is what they willingly turn to in the case of women's reproductive health care. The government decides. What must happen? Here is a really great quote from Adam Gentleson, a former staffer for Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid. He says, if you are not willing to reform the filibuster and expand the court, you are not willing to do what it takes to win this fight. If we keep playing beanbag while they play hardball, the results will be more of this. It's that simple. White House Chief of Staff Ron Klain said on Sunday, and this is from the news shows this weekend, I don't know how many of y'all watched, but on CNN's State of the Union, he said that lawyers at the Justice Department, and we just read a headline about this earlier, are looking for legal remedies to protect women's constitutional rights in Texas. A team at the Department of Health and Human Services is searching for strategies to get women health care services they need with the new law now in place. Senator Amy Klobuchar, Democrat from Minnesota, proposed another way to protect Roe v. Wade on the federal level, eliminating the filibuster, which we talked about, which would allow Democrats to pass a bill with a simple majority vote instead of needing 60 members to support. She says we will just get nowhere if we keep this filibuster in place. That is unlikely to happen, but she also pointed to the Texas law to further bolster her argument for the 83-year-old Supreme Court Justice Stephen Breyer, saying that he should consider retiring sooner rather than later in order to have a chance at a Democrat-appointed justice to retain a narrower conservative majority. Here's something that lifted my heart in a really, really down time. Lift. Speaking of lifting, Lift. I gotta tell you this. I don't want to lose my place. Lyft announced that it created a driver legal defense fund to cover all legal fees for drivers sued under the law while on its platform. The company also said that it was donating $1 million to Planned Parenthood to ensure that transportation is never a barrier to health care access. Texas law threatens to punish drivers for getting people where they need to go, specifically women exercising their right to choose and to access the health care they need. Uber is following suit. They said, thanks for the tip, they said. Thanks for the idea. I'm almost done. So, bottom line, politics has no place in a pregnant person's most personal health care decisions. Every person should be able to make their own decisions about their health and their bodies, including abortion. No one's most personal medical decisions should be controlled by politicians, neighbors, complete strangers, or anyone else. With nearly 600 abortion restrictions introduced across the country, 2021 is the worst year for state legislative attacks on abortion since Roe. So what can we do? Get involved. Planned Parenthood, the National Organization for Women, they are fired up on all kinds of issues, including this new awful law, and they say that they're turning up the heat on lawmakers. They're turning up the heat on economic justice. They're turning up the heat on LGBTQIA issues and rights. They're turning up the heat on racial justice, constitutional equality, and Planned Parenthood is another organization that says the Supreme Court has ignored 50 years of precedent and set back the hands of time, essentially allowing Texas to be a pre-Roe state. This is a travesty for the nearly 7 million women of reproductive age and everyone who supports access to safe legal abortion. I tell you this because these are the organizations that you need to follow along with, I know that Lauren is going to tell you other ways that you can help. The ACLU is another organization. So many organizations that are paying attention to what's going on in this country. So let me say again, thank you to Lauren for organizing this event. It's really important that it not go unnoticed. And thank you all for turning out. Solidarity. Solidarity.
Thank you, Susan. We have here Rachel Stein, who is in charge of all the greeters at Planned Parenthood, who is going to speak to her experience. Rachel?
Hi, everyone. I know that there are many former and current greeters here. If any of you have ever been a greeter or are a greeter, could you put your hands in the air so we can thank you for this work that you do. We are the people who are in the parking lot. We now are there at the crack of dawn. DSA has helped us organize a team who's also there to surveil the parking lot and make sure the staff gets safely into the building. Think of that. Think of that. Think of the need for that. Think of the fact that the staff feel that they need that support. We are, of course, also there for the patients. Can you imagine that you've made a very private decision to go and seek health care, and you may have driven here from out of state. You may have been in your car for hours and hours to get here. And then as you were trying to enter the parking lot to reach medical care, you are, verbally assaulted by hordes of people who are screaming that you are a murderer, that you're ruining your life, that you're a mommy, that your little baby is crying out to you, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And while there are a good number of patients who are, firm in their decisions and don't listen to this bullshit and are just fine going through that mess of people, there are other people who really feel invaded by the fact that these people are allowed to get so close to them and scream to them. And COVID has made it even more complex because companions have to wait outdoors. So the people who have traveled here with a patient are now being assaulted, for hours on end verbally for supporting a patient. So it's important work that all of the greeters do, and I really honor people who are willing to be on the front lines that way. And I just wanted to say, having grown up before Roe v. Wade, that I think we sometimes take for granted all the advances in our society that women have made that really rest on a foundation of having, being able to plan your pregnancies, having access to birth control and education and abortion. Before Roe v. Wade, when I got pregnant before Roe v. Wade, I wouldn't have been able to complete my high school education. You had to drop out of high school in my town if you were pregnant. It was legal to fire women for being pregnant. It was legal to not hire women who were pregnant. And women were only able to really enter higher education and higher professions once we had control of our reproduction. So many advances that we have made just depend on us having this right and this access. So thank you for being here and taking this seriously. We can't go back in that way.
I interviewed on my show a couple of weeks ago David Talbot, who wrote a book on the 60s about 7 different activists from the 60s who were seminal: Jane Fonda, Tom Hayden, Cesar Chavez, and John Lennon, and Heather Booth. Does anybody know the name Heather Booth? Yeah, she was a member of the Jane Collective, which was a group in the late 60s in Chicago that actually was sort of like an underground railroad, if you would, for women who needed abortions. They had contracted with this doctor who was willing to do it even though it was illegal, but then they saw how much money he was taking, And since they had spent so much time watching him do it, they started doing it themselves. And they finally got busted. It's a great story that he tells in this book, and I really hope that we don't have to go back to that kind of place where that's what we're doing. I want to mention that DSA here has a fund that I was privileged to be able to contribute to. Other groups besides Planned Parenthood who are also providing abortions for women who can't afford them. Planned Parenthood is extremely well funded. They do great work, but I would also encourage you to talk to DSA about some of the groups that they fund. And speaking of DSA, my next speaker is Tessa Paul, who is the co-chair of DSA, and she's going to speak on the intersectionality of Medicare for all with women's reproductive rights.
Thank you so much, Lauren, and thank you for organizing this event today. All right, we are gathered here today because there's a war being waged. This war on reproductive rights was waged against women, against trans and non-binary people, against black and brown people, indigenous, queer, and against disabled, displaced, and abused people. All of us deserve safe and easy access to abortion. This is a war being waged against our bodies, our reproductive rights, and our freedom. But let's be very clear about something. What is at the very root of this war? If you have lots of money in this country, with our crooked healthcare system, you can buy access to anything you want, including abortion. So really, this war has always been a war waged against the poor. A war on the multiracial working class. The wealthy want to make abortion illegal because it keeps the poor unstable, overwhelmed, and willing to accept the poorest of working conditions and social conditions. It gives them more poor workers that will fight one another for scraps in order to survive. If the working class remains divided and oppressed, it's easier for the wealthy elite to stay in control and manipulate the masses. The powerful want to use the issue of abortion as a wedge to divide the multiracial working class, to turn us against each other, to distract from exploitation, oppression, and creeping fascism. We cannot separate this war on reproductive rights from the war on voting rights, on fair wages, and workplace democracy. So, what does pro-choice even mean? Right? Choice is a luxury. You don't have a choice if you can't afford reproductive care, if you can't afford family planning, and if you can't afford an abortion. We are not here to simply say that women should have a choice to have an abortion. We are here to demand health justice, reproductive justice, and abortion justice. Right. And that means that family planning, reproductive care, and abortions should not just be legal, they should be free. Reproductive justice means having the right to decide when and if you want to have children, a right that many black, migrant, and poor women have had taken from them in this country throughout U.S. history and, disturbingly enough, very recently in our history. Through forced sterilization, forced childbirth, and rearing of enslaved people, and through poverty wages that leave people with no safe options. That's why, if we want real justice for all of us, we need universal health care. And we need Medicare for all. Medicare for all would end the Hyde Amendment, which prevents federal dollars from being spent on abortions. It's the Hyde Amendment and the hollowing out of working class families that makes abortion services so hard to find here in North Carolina and across the country. The money just isn't there. Medicare for all would mean no insurance needed, no out-of-pocket costs, no co-pays, and no bills for abortion and any other necessary services that require a professional. It would also, by the way, mean free gender-affirming care for all. Yeah. So we need to fight for health justice for the working class. But right now, CVS is spending millions of dollars in dark money to try to defeat Medicare for all. HCA, the company that owns Mission Hospital down the road, is spending millions of dollars in dark money to try to defeat Medicare for all too, to make sure that we don't get health justice. Here's the thing. If we simply fight for Roe v. Wade, for a hollow elitist idea of choice, we are going to lose. They will divide wealthy women against poor women, white women against women of color. But if we fight for democracy, if we fight for power, if we fight for Medicare for all and health justice and abortion justice, if we build a movement of multi-generational, multi-gender, multiracial working class, we will defend Roe v. Wade, but we will do so much more. If you believe that this is a war on women and a war on the multiracial poor and a war on the multiracial working class, you need to pledge today that you will fight not just for choice, but for Medicare for all. Yeah, for health justice, reproductive justice, and abortion justice. Thank you all for showing up today.
I want to thank Susan for mentioning the disproportionate impact that this would have on women of color. I heard a very good talk on this. The interim director of the National Organization for Women Pennsylvania, and she said that ensuring women's reproductive rights is not necessarily going to get racial equity, because there will still be racist doctors who won't perform the care or the best care. And we've seen countless examples of that during COVID. So all of our movements have to be intersectional. And with that in mind, I want to introduce our next speaker, who is Claire Clark. She is a trans rights activist with the Party for Socialism and Liberation, and she's always out here organizing great protests. Claire.
Thank you, Lauren. Thank you for putting this together. I'd like to thank DSA also for your efforts in organizing this. Y'all, my name is Claire Clark. I'm a member of the Asheville branch of the Party for Socialism and Liberation. PSL is made up of leaders and activists drawn from among the vast majority of poor, working, and oppressed Americans, and we are dedicated to fighting for a liberatory, revolutionary, socialist future, a future beyond the capitalist system and its oppressive structures of patriarchy, white supremacy, colonialism, and imperialism. Today I come before you as a transgender woman, here to stand in solidarity with my cisgender sisters, my transmasculine brothers, and my non-binary siblings in the face of the most egregious attack on abortion and reproductive rights in decades. Like a thief in the night, the Supreme Court of the United States, on the word of unelected and unaccountable judges appointed for life by bought and paid for politicians, effectively stole away the right of abortion and the right to true bodily autonomy for women, trans men, and non-binary people, winning the right to a safe and legal abortion and the right to bodily autonomy was the culmination of 3 generations of struggle, and the struggle to hold the line on Roe v. Wade has consumed the energies of 3 more generations of feminists and fighters. All that's gone, vanished overnight, such is the life under the dictatorship of capital and the unjust rule of the capitalist state. Nothing is won without struggle, and without struggle, nothing we win will last. Today I am here in solidarity, but tomorrow I may be here in need. My rights under attack, my future facing foreclosure. I'm a transgender woman. I am a transgender woman. I will never myself need access to abortion care, but the same patriarchal capitalist system that is the root of the oppression of all women, of all trans, non-binary, and queer people is my oppressor too. The bodily autonomy under attack when abortion rights are threatened is the same bodily autonomy under attack when transgender youth are barred by law from seeking appropriate medical support for transition, or when transgender adults are routinely denied access to those same life-saving treatments by our sexist, racist, homophobic, and transphobic for-profit healthcare system. There are many battles to be fought and many pathways to the fight, but there is only one struggle. We face an entire array of oppressive systems lined up against us: white supremacy, patriarchy and misogyny, anti-queer bigotry, colonialism, imperialism, and the carceral state. And at the beating heart, a system and a ruling class that turns oppression into profit and power. The fight to overturn that is the struggle, and we must fight against it everywhere we find it until it is swept away on the tides of history. I know that some of you here today aren't ready to hear this message just yet, but the day is coming when you will be. None of us can hide from this struggle. It will reach into every corner of our lives until we have no choice but to turn and fight. So mark it down, because that day is coming. I am here today in solidarity, but solidarity means I am here to take up this fight as if it were my own, because it is. There is no liberation for some without liberation for all. So I charge everyone here today to be in solidarity with one another. I charge everyone here today to take up this fight, and every fight, as if it were your own. There is a world out there to win, a new world, a better world, a world without oppression, a world without exploitation. That world is not beyond some distant horizon. We can have it right here in the palms of our hands if we fight for it and build it together. Show me what solidarity looks like. Show me what solidarity looks like. Show me what solidarity looks like.
This is what solidarity looks like.
Show me what solidarity looks like.
This is what solidarity looks like.
Thank you.
Thank you, Claire. We're talking about intersectionality, and I was part of the Occupy Wall Street movement and the Bernie Sanders movement, and one of the reasons for that was it was all-encompassing. All of the issues were together, and I found that after Occupy and after Bernie, did not succeed, except, of course, in changing the national conversation, which is very important, everybody sort of went back into their own issue or identity silo. So I want to reinforce the point that Claire just made about solidarity, and all these issues are connected. So if this is your passion, women's reproductive rights, also take a listen when somebody reaches out to you about climate change or racial justice or any of the other issues that are all interconnected. And speaking of those issues, I would like to introduce our last speaker before we call women up to share. And this is Leslie Boyd, and she is my sister from the Poor People's Campaign.
The Poor People's Campaign is where we say forward together, not one step back. And we say that because we have to be together. When you lift from the bottom, everybody rises. So none of our issues are negotiable. Healthcare, give it to us. All of it, including the care I need for my body, whether I decide I'm going to get pregnant or not. And I want to talk a minute about the people who call themselves pro-life. When I was pregnant in 1974, I had a rare virus. My doctor thought it could cause birth defects, and she recommended I have an abortion. Her partner gave me the same recommendation. But the chair was at the table for me. I don't know how other women would have responded, but the chair was already at the table for me. This child already had a name. and I decided to have him. And yes, he had birth defects. And these birth defects prevented him from getting insurance. And without insurance, doctors were able to turn him away and let him die. They knew he would die, and they let him die. And when I tell people about this, I can always tell your mindset. Because if you ask me whether he was working, I know you call yourself pro-life. Because the ones who call themselves pro-life always want to know if he had a job. Like, we've somehow passed the death penalty for unemployment. That's fascist. That right there is fascism. And yes, he did have a job, like that matters. So these pro-life people are fine with my son dying for lack of access to health care. They're fine with 68,000 Americans dying every year as a direct result of lack of access to health care. They're fine with women dying from ectopic pregnancies because they don't want to do an abortion. Maybe it's not ectopic. Let's just wait and see. They're fine with women dying because their abusive partners beat them to death while they're pregnant. I had a friend in high school that happened to. He threw her down the stairs when she was 7 months pregnant and killed her and the baby. But the pro-life people said, well, of course she should marry him. She shouldn't have an abortion. She'd still be here. This has got to stop. This is not pro-life. And we need to call people out when they say abortion is anti-life, because it is not. Abortion is pro-woman. And if you want to call me pro-abortion, just because I say if a woman wants an abortion, she should get one, go ahead, call me pro-abortion. Doesn't hurt. I am pro-woman. When I came of age in Massachusetts, I could not get birth control pills. And the thing was so paternalistic that I wouldn't have gotten in trouble. My doctor would have. Because, of course, women weren't mature enough to think for themselves. So this patriarchal thing has to stop. This anti-woman thing has to stop. We have to stand up and say enough. And if that means we tell the men in our lives, I don't want to risk getting pregnant, you're not having sex again until you come and vote pro-abortion with me. Do it. And I have one more quick solution. But first of all, I want to thank all the men who came, all of you allies. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. And I just want to say, we need to fight against these people who call themselves pro-life. They are not. And we need to call them out. And we need to stand up for what's right. Forward together! Forward together!
Not one step back!
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much to Lauren. I spent some time with her yesterday, and she told me about this event, and I shared with her my story, and she said, would you be willing to share it with a group of people? And I said yes. And then I woke up this morning and I thought that instead of sharing my story in a linear format, I would write it in a poem. I am no Amanda Gorman, but I am a local writer and poet, so. We are the soldiers. We are the warriors of our own bodies, fully capable and able to decide when and if we will bring forth another life. I first marched for this choice in Washington, D.C. in 1983, then almost every year afterward, braving spit, insults, bodily harm, communing with my sisters, to be heard, to be heard. The most memorable moment took place on a park bench just after the march in D.C. in 2003. Me in my 40s, my benchmate in her 60s. She rubbing her feet, me the instigator of chit-chat. Somehow a dam opens and the truth rushes forward. She tells me she was raped when she was 17.
and became pregnant. Her parents forced her to go to a Catholic home for girls, where she delivered a child who was whisked away before she could hold it at 17. At 17, I had an abortion in Austin, Texas. I had the support of my mother and a boy who also had a head filled with dreams and ambition for an adulthood just beginning. Just beginning. She tells me she never married, never had children. I tell her I have 2 young daughters, and I worry for them. She says she worries for all of us. We hug, long and unabashed, 2 strangers bonded for life. We turn and walk away stronger for the intimacy. And I wonder, which woman has peace of mind and untroubled sleep? Neither of us. Neither of us. I want to dedicate that poem to my mother, who in 1956 was in Manhattan starting a modeling career, and she could not afford to get an abortion when she discovered that she was in the middle of an unwanted pregnancy. And so she took weeks collecting money from friends. She could not go to family or anyone else. And she flew to Mexico and had a very unsafe abortion, which she survived. So I think of her today, and I am here to say, we will not go back. We will not go back.
I found the meme. It says, "Welcome to Texas. Let's get this straight. A state that criminalizes abortion but ranks 50th in baby wellness checks, ranks 50th in clinical care for infants, ranks 50th in uninsured women, ranks 43rd in maternal mortality, ranks 44th in school funding per child, and ranks 46th in child hunger. Let's get this straight. Texas doesn't give a damn about children."
Thank you so much for setting this up and for doing all of the work on this, Lauren. My name is Stefany Mills, and this is the first time I've actually shared my story publicly. People who are closest to me know it, but it's a big thing. When I was 22 years old, my boyfriend at the time, he and I had just broken up, and my mother looked at me and went, "I think you're pregnant." What? And turned out I was. And I thought that I had no choice in my own mind whether to just have this baby. I knew that I was not someone who had the strength that some other women have to have a baby and give that baby up for adoption. And I was terrified. I was also very bulimic. When I found out I was pregnant, I managed to eat a meal and keep it down, but I was terrified about that too. I didn't know if I could manage to be healthy throughout a pregnancy. So when both of my parents, my mother and my father, said, "You do have another option," I was really fortunate. I was fortunate to have their support, financially and emotionally. I was able to be with them after the fact, and I was able to go through with having an abortion, which ultimately was one of the best things, the best choices I ever made. I went on to have a full life, to have 2 daughters, have a great marriage, and one of those daughters in particular, if she ever gets pregnant, will have to have an abortion, or that pregnancy could kill her. And that is a terrifying, terrifying thought for me. I want both of my daughters to have that option, but the fact is, my one daughter not having that option, she loses her life. So this is so important and so terrifying, and as you said, it all intersects with our need for health care, and the fact that in the event that she were to go through with that, there's a good chance that her insurance company wouldn't cover it anyway. Isn't that awesome? Thanks for your time, and thanks for listening.
Thank you, Stefany, for sharing that story.
The only thing I want to add to this is that I happen to know because of a personal situation that happened to a family member of mine who was severely raped here on her graduation night from UNCA. And she went to the hospital. They did the rape kit. They have the men. They know who they are. And to this day, they have done nothing with her rape kit. I happen to know that in North Carolina, rape kits sit in warehouses and get really dusty. And how many women are out here who have been raped, who did get abortions, which none of us ever want? How many men are free to go? And my question is, how many men out there who are screaming at abortion clinics have had vasectomies? And why are they not getting vasectomies? Why are we not insisting they get vasectomies? It is time for us to really be in solidarity about every bit of these issues. Thank you.
Thank you for bringing that up. This was a huge issue in North Carolina, but several years ago, Attorney General Josh Stein, Democratic Attorney General Josh Stein, I will say, sought funding, state funding, to start processing the years and years of rape kits that were in those warehouses and sitting on shelves in police stations. And we have made enormous progress on that as a state. Buncombe County in particular, I believe almost all of our backlog is gone. So those have been processed. Josh Stein will tell you that a handful of men have been arrested and are being prosecuted because of, not here necessarily in Buncombe County, but across the state because of the processing of those rape kits. And he has requested, and I believe there is funding in the budget, for him to continue that work and clear out the backlog statewide.
There is a war on women in this country, and I don't want to elaborate, but reproductive rights is just one. And we have to remember that, yes, capitalism is a big problem, but also the patriarchy is a big problem. And I want people to sign up before they leave. We've got 2 sign-up sheets, I guess, one for DSA and one for the War on Women page. I think that the pressure really has to be on Manchin and Sinema at this point. They have to fall in line with their party. And also, Republican women that you know, start the conversations. Start them now. We have to protect the rights we've gained. We can't afford to go back 50 years into the last century with these coat hanger abortions. What do we do when we're under attack? Stand up, fight back. What do we do when we're under attack?